I suppose one of the things, you tell me, um, most people know, if you know anything really about Lenin, is the interesting fact that he wasn't proletarian. He wasn't poor, he wasn't peasant, he wasn't even a kulak, was he? He was from relatively wealthy. I mean, I wouldn't say his family were rolling in money, but they were sort of firmly middle class. Tell me what your take is on that. His father was a nobody, but his mother's side they had a big house, didn't they, and servants and all that sort of thing, no?
I don't really think it's surprising at all. I mean, I've always associated most prominent left-wing movements as being comprised almost entirely of bourgeois types. I've always considered it to be a bourgeois movement which claims to represent the working class as opposed to genuinely be comprised of the working class. But to answer your question specifically, his father was one. He wasn't born Lenin. Lenin was a nom de guerre, a pseudonym. His birth name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and his father was one Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, who was quite prominent. He was the superintendent or the inspector for public schools in Simbirsk, which was a region sort of between what is later become Stalingrad and Kazan in the Volga region. And
would you characterize that as a backwater? Am I going too far to say that?
I wouldn't necessarily consider it a backwater. I mean, we're not talking about Siberia here. It's obviously in Russia. Russia is such a large country, but I suppose there is, some proximity towards Moscow. But as far as, it's very removed from St. Petersburg, which during the imperial era was of course, the capital of the Russian Empire, but not a very prominent region, no. But his father was at least significant within that particular governorate, so I wouldn't write him off. Indeed, Lenin's ancestry is quite sort of varied. I mean, you have some Jewish ancestry, some Volga German ancestry. I mean, that's only really to be expected because the region just south of Simbirsk would later, during the Soviet Union, actually become the Volga German Republic. And its capital would later be renamed Engels, of course, after Friedrich Engels, Marx's longtime collaborator. So you can say a cosmopolitan and bourgeois background for Lenin.
Would you say it's closer to sort of Central Asia than it is sort of the European side of Russia? Again, am I overstating that? Because I know in Russia that they're, it's so massive, obviously, all the way out to the Pacific, but there is sort of a fairly, well, I think, sort of fairly well-defined European end of Russia. Would you say Lenin's sort of not of that, or would you say he is more?
I think geographically, Simbirsk is, of course, I wouldn't say relatively close, but nearish to the borders of modern-day Kazakhstan.
Right,
and all of the stans, of course, were comprised of were within the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, but it is still in the core of Russia as it is today. And I think despite being, geographically sort of close to Kazakhstan and the Urals, it should also be noted that because of the Volga-German association, you can say that this region was actually rather cosmopolitan in the same way that St. Petersburg was, despite being a seemingly rather rural backwater. Of course, if you go south, you have Kalmucks who are of Mongolian descent. You have the various Cossack hosts. Then, of course, into the south, you have the Ossetians, and you have the remnants of the Circassians, most of whom have moved into Turkey, and of course the Caucasian nations, which will briefly become independent during the Russian Revolution, only to be reincorporated forcefully back into the Soviet Union. So, I mean, it's a sort of a misnomer to consider Russia as in any way ethnically homogenous. Russia has today a heterogeneous population. Indeed, that was amplified during the Imperial Russian era. Yeah, we're talking a landmass which goes from Warsaw in the west to Kolmia in the east. I mean, was 1/6 of the world's total landmass was the Russian Empire during this time. But I think we're almost going off track if we're going to talk about the life of Lenin.
I was going to say, just in my mind, that as an Englishman from born and bred in home counties, that just feels like more Central Asia than Europe. But anyway, one thing just before we move on from his family, I just wanted to try and pin down. Well, I think it's really interesting to say that sort of leftism or socialism is quite often sort of more middle class intellectuals than is actually the working man. Obviously, someone like Orwell talks about that quite well in something like The Road to Wigan Pier. Stalin would be an exception to that, being brought up in real poverty. But yeah, Lenin, it was brought up later, sort of during his political life, saying, "Wait a minute, aren't you more than a kulak yourself?" And he just said, "Yeah, well," basically just brush it off, just saying, "Yeah, well, whatever, it is what it is. I'm the leader of the party, so deal with it," sort of thing. But I suppose he did have a good education, though, didn't he? Relatively good. I mean, he was sent to quite a good school and passed out with flying colours. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, in the same year that he completed his studies and then went off to the University of Kazan to study law, this is 1887, his older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, tried to assassinate the then Tsar Alexander III. So we're talking about a family with a infamous revolutionary association. And of course, that incident scandalized the family because it was such a public fall from grace, so to speak. And in many ways, you can say it actually created a bit of notoriety for Lenin, and you can say fame within various left-wing revolutionary movements due to his association with the hero who attempted to assassinate the evil, repressive, reactionary Alexander III. But it's not a sort of immediate process where it's rather simple to look at the psychology and say the execution of his brother leads to him becoming a revolutionary agitator. But his intellectual experience goes through various phases. So at the University of Kazan, he is essentially censured for nascent political agitation when he becomes associated with various left-wing councils. And he's actually exiled during this time to a place called Kokoshkino. However, it's during this time also that he's exposed to the ideas of Fedor Isiev and Marxist literature in particular. And you can say the only person who's trying to rescue him during this time is his mother, Maria Ulyanov, who's already lost one son to revolutionary agitation. And she attempts to physically move Lenin away from these sources of potential radicalization, even wanting to take him back to a simple life as a farmer very briefly. Of course, this doesn't work very well. Lenin escapes the clutches of his mother, goes to Samara, joins various discussion circles, and by this time he's become fully immersed in Russian Marxism and will later pen his own articles.
Yeah. Well, one thing I just wanted to ask, just quickly backtrack ever so quickly on is his brother again, because I think that is a big thing. I don't want to get too much into sort of armchair psychology. You know, I'm not a psychologist, but he was thought of as, well, you described him as a hero or heroic on some level, but like a martyr for the cause or something. So just to let people know, there was an assassination of one of the Tsars, two Tsars before Nicholas II. What was it? Was it Alexander I? Isn't it? Alexander II. Sorry, that's right, Alexander II, who was successfully blown up and killed, but not by Lenin's brother personally. But Lenin's brother was arrested, tried, and executed for being in on that plot. Right, that's the overview. That's the takeaway, isn't it?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Just saying that Alexander II was killed, although not personally by Lenin's elder brother.
No. This
Lenin's
is
elder brother
this is a different plot. The assassination of Alexander II was carried out by a group called the Narodnya Volya, which means the People's Will, in 1881.
Was Lenin's brother not in that organisation?
No,
I thought he was in there. Okay. I've got this wrong.
The assassination by, I can't remember exactly what organisation Lenin's brother was a member of, but after 1881, members of the Narodnya Volya were systematically hunted down and sent to Siberia, if not executed. Indeed, this is the time where Russia is amping up their secret police and their security against left-wing terrorism, which is, of course, the Okhrana. But Alexander Ulyanov was implicated in an attempt to assassinate the son of Alexander II, Tsar Alexander III, in 1887. Of course, he was the father of Nicholas II.
Yeah. So actually, they're years apart, aren't they? They're years apart. I had that wrong in my mind. I think I've said on a recording somewhere else. I've got that wrong in my mind. You're absolutely right. There was one of the more famous plots to try and kill Alexander III was to blow up the train he was in. And isn't there sort of almost a folk story of him holding up the half-destroyed train so that his family could escape? Did Lenin's brother have anything to do with that one?
That wasn't actually an assassination attempt.
Oh, okay.
That was a screw-up by the controller of transport, who was forcing the train to go too fast, effectively, so it derailed. But during that particular situation, Alexander III was known as essentially being a giant, so he held up the collapsing train carriage and allowed the Romanov family to escape, essentially saving his family's life. But of course, I think this had long-term implications because he died very young, in his 40s, in the year 1894, leading to an inexperienced Tsar Nicholas II to take the reins of the autocracy.
But so in the end, the upshot is that Lenin's elder brother was tried for, well, I don't know, treason, sedition, just being subversive, and executed. And so I want to ask you, what extent do you think Lenin put his elder brother on a pedestal? Because I think there's two contradictory things or two conflicting ideas. That one, he was a martyr, a hero on some level, and that Lenin did put him on a pedestal on some level, but also Lenin sort of at the time and all the way through his adulthood also thought his brother was foolish on some level for doing that and throwing his own life away, and he was just on the wrong political track in all sorts of ways. So I wonder what your feelings are. What do you think? How do you think Lenin felt about his older brother and his execution?
Well, by the time he became involved in serious revolutionary activity in St. Petersburg, I think his mind was made up as to what his brother's legacy represented. There is an apocryphal statement by Lenin, which claims essentially that what his brother's attempted assassination of Alexander III represented was the wrong way in politics. That, as with the assassination of Alexander II, which I think is very important you brought up, what did the assassination of Alexander II lead to? A more reactionary Tsar and the dissolution of most of the left-wing agitating groups during that time. So these symbolic gestures, the idea that the assassination of the Tsar would simply bring about this utopian society, this post-Tsar society, I believe Lenin was intelligent enough, and I do need to emphasize here that Lenin really did have an exemplary intellect to be able to understand these things and had a capacity for developing structures of organization and logistics, which enabled him to see a means of attaining power, not simply of removing the existing power structure. I mean, if you go down this sort of line of thinking, in order to really remove the Romanovs from power, you would need to systematically murder all of them in quick succession, which, given how many Romanovs there are, is rather impossible. No matter how many you assassinate, you'll be able to pin one Grand Duke or one prince who can fill that role. And even if you get rid of all of them, a military man would be able to come in and say, for example, like a Kolchak later on, and assert some sort of right-wing government even then. So I think Lenin was cognizant of all of this. And you can say that this later develops into his idea that rather than opting for these, you can say, suicidal demonstrations of antipathy towards the Tsarist government, one needs to have a program for the acquisition of political power, and therefore one needs to represent a government in waiting, which he successfully creates. Because if you look at the early life of Lenin and you look at the Russian Revolution, what is remarkable is how haphazard it was, how he was able to bring himself into power. I think it's less remarkable how he was able to attain power, but that he was able to keep it effectively, given that so many governments had come into power after the fall of Tsar Nicholas II in early 1917 and had fallen very quickly or destabilized effectively. And this is, you could say, the beginning of this, the establishment or the creation in his mind of a hard political program, and which organizations were essentially going to help him to rise to power and which organizations would be a detriment to that. Because you have to think what he represented by the sort of the turn of the 20th century was a very cosmopolitan European form of socialism, which was very alien to the Russian psyche at this point. Most Russian left-wing thought as of then was tending towards anarchism or towards the almost utopian ideas associated with agrarian reform, the idea that is the peasant community, the village, that represents the real heart of Russia. So it's basically a contest between the local center and the centralizing Tsarist government. And in this idea of essentially it's the narodniks, the people's friend, it is the peasant who represents the soul of Russia, not the proletariat. Even though there had been an attempt during the reign of Alexander III to really kickstart Russia's industrialization by the turn of the 20th century was relegated to a few key cities: Kiev, Kharkov, Moscow, St. Petersburg. And so the idea that the proletariat, in the European sense, the urban, working, unskilled laboring classes, could represent a sort of revolutionary class in Russia almost seemed preposterous. But that was the Marxist model which had been imported into Russia, which Lenin was now adopting.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.